And so building better actionable tools there and supporting the first line sales managers or account managers, et cetera, I think is a huge weakness in organizations today and something you really need to focus on, because at the end of the day, all change is going to live and die with them, right? If they don't take it seriously or if they don't do this, people are going to struggle and they're going to go back to their old habits regardless. And then I think at the field level, as where we started, it's then being able to provide those same sort of actionable insights to the field.
Welcome to Revenue Insights. Every week, we'll be joined by revenue leaders from some of the most successful and highest growing companies. Together, we explore how they built their revenue teams, the journeys that they've been on, and the lessons they have learned along the way. Revenue Insights is brought to you by Ebster. We're a revenue intelligence platform designed to help revenue teams to build more pipeline, close more deals, and retain more customers.
Hello there. You are listening to Revenue Insights. Today, I'm joined by Zach Gropper. He's the founder and CEO of Insight Revenue. Before setting up his own business, Zach led sales teams at Gartner, Challenger, and CEB. Zach, really excited to get down into the detail today.
Hey, Lee, thanks for having me. Excited for the conversation today as well.
Okay. You've had a really interesting kind of history, worked at some pretty huge organizations in the sales space. Have come all the way around now to creating your own thing with Insight Revenue. So for anyone that hasn't heard about you before, come across you, could you give a little bit more context around your story? Yeah,
sure. So not to bore everybody to make it too long, but I've got a little white hair, so a few different careers that got me here. I live in Barcelona today. I've lived here for about the last 8 years, but actually, as you can probably tell, I'm from the States. So I've, one part of my career, I've lived and worked in about 20 different countries. A lot of that starting at like my first sales job ever, selling luggage on Greenwich Avenue in Connecticut, through to really working with very large enterprise organizations and expanding around the world. I think probably the most interesting, part to focus on as part of that story was I'd never gone to business school. I never worked in corporate America per se. And after doing a lot of international work, I wanted to not only be the best at sales or the best at sales management, I wanted to also learn like how do big companies really work and function. And so there's this company called CEB, which is now actually part of Gartner, but not a lot of people would have heard of the Corporate Executive Board. So it was a fascinating company that was based out of Washington, D.C., and way back in 2006, they were on this really interesting mission to take what was a business model like Gartner with specialty around functional areas of excellence and best practice and research. And they had this interesting problem, which is they were rolling out all this research to the market, but companies would take that research and actually try to drive change in strategy, change in behaviors and process. And what they realized is because of the nature of this being cutting edge research, most of their typical go-tos, whether it's McKinsey or your local consultant or doing it yourself, people just didn't have the experience with these practices. So CEB was faced with this challenge from their customers to say, let's build a better version of professional services. And let's build that as part of, let's move away from our membership type business to actually be able to help companies drive change and go to market. And I joined that when they were looking at the sales and marketing side of their research. And that ended up being 16 years of my life there. The name changed many times when I was there of that business. So we took that business, CB was about 300 million revenue. We became $1 billion revenue company before Gartner acquired us. We were actually the fastest growing part of that business when it was acquired. And then we were sold off to private equity as the company Challenger. And so I went from working with the first companies in the field, trying to actually implement this work with my own clients, to then being able to think of much more interesting and newer, more strategic ways for our business to work with them. And then ultimately running the international business. And at one point I had 4 or 5 offices outside the US when we were trying to figure out how you serve what was perceived as a very American way of doing things in many, many international markets. And so, that role taught me a lot about not only what best practice research and science is of selling, which was fascinating and never got old. And I thought I would have left there after 2-3 years, but stayed there, for a very long time. It also taught us a lot about like how companies actually, get from that 80% of getting an idea to actually that important sort of running to ground behavior change and strategy changes to get them to stick in wildly different shapes and sizes of companies over the years. And then the only thing to add on the back end of that is just having taken that knowledge, mostly working with large enterprise organizations, I've done some of my own scale up gigs since then. So I was able to help a company called AirDNA scale and sell their business to private equity as well. So I've had a couple exits under the belt now, and worked as a CRO in a couple different fields before I decided to, hey, let's put this all back to work and try to do it, as good as humanly possible and in better and more innovative and agile ways in the market with Insight Revenue, which I guess is the flip side of Revenue Insight. So it brings us here today.
Clearly, great minds came together in the naming of both our podcast and your business. I really like that. And from your background, very much seen there and done it right from, as you say, from large enterprise organizations down to your scale up. So what would you say then it is about what you've learned from those experiences to then kind of reach the point of going, you know what, from your experience, there's a different way, a better way of doing things, and that inevitably, I assume, leads into what you're now championing with Insight Revenue. So, how would you say your approach, based on your experience, is different to the status quo? Let's say.
Yeah, and I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of really smart organizations, and the idea is like, how do you build on some of the best IP and really science, right, that there is to actually go to the next level now? And that's obviously our mission is to say, okay, looking at learning how customers have been buying and what drives loyalty over the last 20 years from a scientific perspective, but then actually having the unique experience of working with hundreds of companies to try to drive change. As in any business, I think every business has its limitations based on its business model and its profit models, and also having observed hundreds of companies try to drive, let's call it commercial transformation over the years. I've just also seen that the things that go wrong, right? And so it's always been an aspiration of mine. I've been taking a little, I have a notebook with also my colleagues. We've come together with a passion for like, well, if you could do it all again based on the same science and research, like what are the things that you would actually do slightly differently to improve the traction that you get in the market? And the other thing that we find is that, if you look at the capabilities that partnerships that people have, the opportunity that's out there, it's like consulting companies are great and can bring in great ideas, but they're really terrible at actually implementing change and getting behavior change to stick and doing any kind of training work. Training companies, on the flip side, aren't really good at actually helping with the real change management that makes most of these programs important. And there's a lot of great IP and branded methodologies out there, but generally based on the confines of their business model, they can't actually adapt what they're doing to your business. Like that would make them too not profitable. So they try as best as they can to bring in a lot of ideas, but unfortunately those ideas stick at the theory level for the most part and don't resonate or stick in the organization for the long term. And so if you look at kind of the things that we think organizations really need to focus on and the things that break, it's the ability to really be strategic about change management with any type of go-to-market model change or transformation you're going through. It's making sure what you're doing is actually really tangible at the field level, so it integrates into the day-to-day of the people who are actually engaging and talking with your customers. And so I know maybe later we'll talk about, well, how's that different for an SDR versus an AE versus an AM or CS individual? And then there's kind of the, how do you get implementation right? So there's actually a structure to driving these kinds of changes and sort of the building blocks, processes, tools you need to have in place to make sure that it all aligns within the organization and that you're actually able to not only get initial ideas to stick, but improve over time. And so, there's a lot we've learned across hundreds and hundreds of companies we've worked with. And then, of course, like personally, I've had to build and scale many sales teams myself and sort of take these ideas and try to say, like, how does this work in the real world with my teams? And fortunately, I've had a chance to do that with a number of different companies now myself. And that kind of combined gives me a rich balance, I think, of like theory and science, but also, hey, at the end of the day, like people need to understand how this fits in their day job, and it can't be rocket science for a lot of organizations. So I've worked, in some regard, worked with organizations who sell tens of $billion projects, like Siemens and turbines, at that level with large enterprise. But I've also worked with organizations that have an average sales cycle of 2 months or 5,000 to 6,000 ACV. And like the ideas and the science need to really plug into what intimately an organization is doing today and how their customers operate and buy. And that's kind of, I think closing that gap is a big gap in the market that I think we've got a better mousetrap at this point to fill.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on what I think is a really important point there, and around you've got the strategy and the theory of it, as you put it, and then there's the execution of it, which so often is the hardest part of it. And I know from conversations that we've had kind of leading into this podcast today, we've been talking a lot about, using data and insight to drive what those changes are. It's something that resonates, that comes up a lot in the podcast whenever we talk around revenue operations, because often it's so amazing the insight that you get and the level of insight that you get. But the challenge then is, now how do I get my sales teams on board with this? How do I get my customer success teams on board with this? So from your perspective, and I really liked the point that you made around if you could do it all again, what would you do differently? So if we took that almost as like a blank slate, and if you're going into a kind of a mid-market business now, and once you've kind of taken stock of it, what does that process look like for you in terms of what do you do differently based off of those instinctive things that you would normally do, which is, perhaps, we need activity. Let's just do lots of cold calling, right? What would you say is your approach, and what have you learned from those experiences?
Yeah. So I guess there's a lot to unpack as far as like what good looks like at different levels. And I like to start with, because you could look at the organization itself, like what is it building the machinery and operations. But I like to always try to take a step back and look at the customer first. Excuse me. And so, one of the key things that we always learn is there's two kinds of cultures or attitudes in an organization, if you want to really simplify. And one is an inside out type of organizational approach, and one is an outside in. And just to explain the difference of those two is, if you think of product-led growth, if you think of what the machinery of most sales organizations have been built to do, it's like, we've got great products, we've now innovated them and have great new features and benefits that we want to bring to market. And so our machinery is really focused on like, let's drive our story into the market and make sure everybody knows about all the cool new stuff or the cool stuff we can do for them, right? And it's interesting because we'd seen that, that was the dominant way most companies sold. Then they'd gone through some evolutions to try to get into like more solution selling because they were getting commoditized. And then the era of kind of insight selling or, challenger type of selling evolved. But if you actually look at what's happened over the last 5 years, it's really interesting to see, especially let's talk about B2B SaaS, like middle market B2B SaaS as a good example. A lot of what the sales process that's oriented today is doing, it's really glorified product selling, right? It's kind of going back to an older era where people were sort of like very differentiated, and globalization hadn't happened. But at the time, there has been so much money flooding into the ecosystem, like easy money, and especially into tech stacks and things like that a lot of companies have really used that as, it's almost like a drug. It's like, okay, so all we got to do, even have is like an average product, and there's enough money over the last several years that let's just build teams, and they bring in lots of like junior level people, and they've been churning and growing with all this PE and VC money. And it did work to an extent, and we've seen kind of the result of that. And so if you actually break down to what's actually happening in most organizations today, they're now faced with the reality, which is they don't really understand their customers very well. So if you go into your teams and actually ask them, like what do your buyers really care about? What are the problems that they have? What gets them hired or promoted or fired in their organization? What are they really trying to do with, let's call it your software or your solution? Not many people at the front line of your organization, maybe even at the leadership level, can clearly articulate that. Maybe the product organization knows about the users, right? The user level, and there's some information there which is useful. But at the end of the day, understanding the buyers and the strategies, I think that's something that's kind of gotten skipped over, unfortunately, in a lot of organizations over the last several years, especially when you're bringing in a lot of less experienced people and just kind of building this, high velocity churning machine. Now everyone's trying to do more with less. Now there's this big focus to quality over quantity. And so, or at least hopefully there is. And I think what you want to do now is really be able to take a look at, like, let's root and align our organization on how well we understand the customer, starting with their challenges and their objectives. Then really you have to understand, being data-driven as an organization, like what makes them tick. The CFO right now is going through a decision-making process with their team saying, let's get rid of every nice-to-have software that we have in our stack, especially if it hasn't been adopted or used. And there's a lot of shouting matches going on during those conversations. And we've seen the result, which means you've got these sort of big waves of downsell happening, which are affecting your AMC or CS organizations. And so when I look at, like, what's the opportunity now companies have, it's like, let's get back with, some of us would say it's the basics of, like, know thy customer, right? So as far as what we focus on now, it's like, okay, first of all, let's make sure you really understand what makes your buyer universe tick. How do you quantify and track and measure what they're trying to achieve? And most importantly, like, what is the cost of the status quo to them? If you need people in a tight budget environment to make decisions and be able to defend, to the CFO or the board, your product or solution, you've got to be able to talk about the cost of status quo and the ability to get them to, let's elevate the urgency and importance of working with you. And that's really about building a business case. It's really about understanding your customers. It's really about product marketing, asking different questions to your customers to get this type of information, which ultimately it is the heart, it's the bread and butter of the conversations that your AEs, AMCS people have to have. But it's also the bread and butter of the content strategy that you should have as far as how you're laying the breadcrumbs with your social media and all your other content strategy to lead people back to you, so that when they actually reach you, they're oriented to buy the way that you're differentiated, which is really, really important as far as quality business versus stuff you need to kick out of your pipeline. So for us, it starts there. The tip of the spear is a lot of the work we recognize we're doing in the past, as far as, like, what types of conversations drive loyalty. We did a lot of work strategy, on really understanding, like, what does a customer experience and buying experience need to be like? What kinds of information actually drive the dial on loyalty? What types of skills and behaviors actually drive the needle on that? And then if you put two and two together, it's like, if you have a deep understanding, you use that to actually have better conversations with your customer, then there has to be the implementation or the structure in between. So nowadays you've got RevOps, which is great. A lot of companies have a CRO model, which is great because you can break down the barriers and align the teams, but you need to be able to bring in sort of a new operating system to operate this way, which is not a push out to market, but it's from working from your customer back, right? So it's really that outward in, which I think is threaded through everything that we do. So it's, if you want to simplify it, it comes down to that customer understanding to create better content and insights via insight revenue and revenue insight. Like, that's the currency today that brings differentiation and value, and all the science, there's some great science that proves that. And then it's like, well, how do you drive change in your organization and drive alignment? And then how do you actually give the people at the front line a real leg up, especially people with not a lot of experience, to have these better interactions, more value-driven interactions. And then on the AMCS side, to actually demonstrate impact, so it's much easier to renew, cross-sell, and expand. So sorry, that was a bit of a large picture, but, like, I think that sort of encapsulates, like, if you don't do one of those key, like, legs of the stool, you're very likely to have to go back 6 months later and think of a new idea.
I really like the summary that you've given across the customer journey there. And I think the bit that's most interesting to me, and we've talked a lot about the strategy and the theory at the top of it, but it's then there's so many different ways that you can get into the tactical pieces around actually aligning on that customer journey. So appreciate that we could spend a lot of time going through each one by one, but to you,
3 hours, right, Lee?
Everyone listening is probably just checking the phone. 3 hours? Stick it on 2 times speed. Let's pick on one of them. Which would you say, do you think, is the most overlooked, let's say, where the consistency is lost in terms of the customer, the customer need? Where is it often, and where are those breakdown points typically in the business that you've worked in and that you work with?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, like, a lot of times when I talk to CROs and CEOs these days, like, they're doing a reanalysis of their pipeline, and they're thinking about where are the critical breakdowns so that they can figure out how they get more with less, or how they maximize in this environment. And I think the interesting thing is actually when most people do that, there's sort of a hammer looking for a nail. And so I think if you see where the problem is, in most cases, the problem actually started earlier, which is an interesting conversation in its own. But I think the main inflection points, if we look at them, it's like there's these really critical moments in the relationship with the customer. Obviously, there's the handoff between SDR and AE, which is really interesting. And there's a lot of, I mean, my goodness, if you ever spend any time on LinkedIn, there's plenty of people out there talking about outbound and talking about filling the funnel. And I think there's a lot of interesting work that needs to be done to improve that first sales interaction or the disco demo, particularly with SaaS as an example. But I think there's some attention there. There could always be more, and definitely a lot we could talk about. I think the next one, though, that actually doesn't get enough attention is the handover between sales and AM or sales and CS. And I think it's a little neglected, and it's going to rise significantly in importance because what you see happening right now is obviously there's a lot of downselling going on, and it's really, really tough in most markets, unless you're selling into really traditional markets. But especially as a SaaS business or selling into SaaS, it's really hard to get new logos these days. And the cost of sale is going up and up and up, right? And so everyone knows like it's way cheaper to get money from existing customers than it is from new customers. But like really being thoughtful about that as an organization to think about like, well, what are we doing to be able to maximize opportunity that we have? Because literally the customers that we have right now, if you're a SaaS supplier, someone has decided not to cut you. Like they literally have made a choice, probably with a board or CFO. So now that they've decided to keep you, like what are you able to do in that space? And so there's some really interesting focus on expansion that's going on now. And people are really shifting towards expansion revenue as a priority. But at the same time, a lot of pressure is now coming down on the CS leadership team and the CS performers as individuals and account management, which is interchangeable in some organizations, to say like, okay, now you're salespeople, like go out and we're going to put a huge bogey on you guys actually growing the organization. And I think the problem is that those teams were not built to do that. People who went into like take CS in particular, like people didn't go into CS because they wanted to be salespeople. They're uncomfortable with commercial conversations. They want to, in some cases, be very reactive. Like that's the disposition is we love reacting, responding, problem solving the customer needs. And that's a different role as well. And then they're uncomfortable with some of the things. If you actually look at the science around what actually drives commercial success, things like using tension and taking control, like some of those hallmarks of what's driving high performance in sales, these are things that team is very uncomfortable with. And then you put on top of that, like the number of stakeholders. I love the EBSTA data and the research you guys put out with Pavilion. That it's really looking at like how do you think about relationship health and the number of everyone's talking about multi-threading. Look, these folks a lot of times they know how to talk to maybe the users and maybe they know how to talk to the buyers, but at the same time, like that whole universe of strategic people that actually put those initiatives in place and run the budgets, like they are really struggle with how do they talk to those folks and get access to them as you think about like the things that really matter. And then ultimately, when we look at the great research done by CEB and Gartner over the years, what actually drives renewal for an existing account, it's a lot having to do with the quality of service and the quality of the product, right? But at the same time, what drives expansion for an account? It's the ability to do something that's actually like articulating business value, talking about customer impact. And I think these teams are less business savvy than they need to be typically to say, how do we talk about value in terms that actually relates to the customer versus like vanity metrics that might show up as like the things we think are important, but actually do not drive the needle at all. And so if you look at the critical breakdown that typically happens is one point, it's the handover between sales and how you actually drive, onboarding, adoption, time to value, expansion, renewal, like that journey, that service roadmap, if you will. Companies need to be much more thoughtful about how to execute it. But ultimately, if you don't get that handover right, and you don't do that really deep work at understanding the customer at the beginning, you're never going to get any of the rest of it right. And I think companies are going to struggle with that right now. So it's a big area of focus for our business.
All right, then. So what does the perfect handover look like? How should folks listening to the podcast today be designing their handovers, and how do they get more value out of it?
Sure. Where's the silver bullet? So you just create a form, the handover form that everybody fills out. We know that the salespeople love filling that out properly. And then, the account manager or CS person, they know everything and they're just off to the races. It's true. I think a lot of companies are looking at that process to make sure, like, do we have the right information that's transitioning over? And I think you do need to think in practical terms, like, what can we learn through the buying process to actually integrate that into the knowledge that we need to effectively launch that customer. And I think learning a lot of companies are going to go through is they're going to actually debate, should our CS team or account managers actually be involved prior to the close? I think that's a really great opportunity to create the alignment and make stand up that customer for success. And oh, by the way, if you actually look at data, like companies like to buy from teams. They don't just trust what the salesperson's saying. And you've got this whole team buying this thing, whether you see them or not in that process. And if you're not bringing other people into the process as well, like the level of credibility and trust and the setup for success. So I think that's where you can start. It's by thinking about, how do we get these teams to overlay and work together where it makes sense, especially on priority accounts? How do we make sure that whatever the package is that's going between the account executives and the AMs or the CS folks, it's really gotten to the root of, like, who cares about this initiative? Why? Why is it important? How do they track and measure what success looks like? And ultimately, what's the existing problem that we're trying to solve for? So not just focusing on the ROI if we do this really well, but focusing on the cost of the problems that are happening right now that we immediately need to jump on. And we're the main reason that there's urgency to get this done. And so if they're able to do that, if the account executives are able to do that and then hand that story over, then you're already set up to say, okay, here's where we're going to be your partners for success, and talk about that versus, this is how we're going to share all the great features and benefits of our platform or our product. Like, that's the focus of the onboarding discussion. So they think, we're thinking about utilization as the key objective, but actually we should be thinking more about how are they going to, define success when our buyer goes to the CFO and asks for more money, or more definition. So the handover really needs to package up what that story is, what they're trying to achieve. It has to get a little bit into the metrics. And then what we need to avoid as account managers and CS folks is I think they get shy about, oh my God, like, they've had so many conversations before I got here. The last thing I want to do is piss off my new customer by making them tell me everything all over again. And so you just jump back into sort of talking about yourselves, right? Like, and you're only setting yourself up then as an expert on yourself and your products, which means when you do your check-ins, when you do your QBRs, they may not even show up because they know you're just going to talk about yourself and try to sell them more stuff. Whereas if you start that conversation based around, hey, we work with companies like you to achieve this objective all the time. Here's the things you want to avoid. These are the mistakes other folks make. These are the things that actually drive success. Like, if you do that from the beginning of that handover process, when you first are onboarding the client, they're going to want to pick up the phone and call you to actually teach them how to be smarter. And that's really the pivot point we want in the relationship for organizations that we work with.
Yeah, and I think it also, to talk to it even from a marketer's perspective to the other end of the journey, is actually that information becomes valuable when you get into the realms of, adoption of your product as well, right? Because obviously once you've got them onboarded, you want them to be using it and to be getting value from it. And also it's like, oh my God, we've got all of these great features and these guys, they're not using any of it. And what I find the conversation always begins with is, why did they buy it in the first place? Because when we know why they, purchased it and what problem that we're trying to solve, that'll help, from a product marketing perspective, then the kind of messaging that you want to create to be like, hey, you're sending out an email, for example, it's like, hey, did you know that you can do this? Did you know you're able to do all of these extra things that you're paying for at the minute, but you're actually not getting value out of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is nobody wants to hear from you as a salesperson, it shouldn't be about you. You are a vehicle, you're a conduit for knowledge. And I think it's, as a salesperson, you're talking to so many other people who have that job every day. And if you're not learning a lot of valuable information and sharing it, then you're not doing justice to yourself or to the prospect. But it's even more contingent upon you that you as an account manager or a CS person, like, you talk to so many existing customers who are willing to share anything with you, like what's working, what's not working. Like, you can be a conduit for those stories. And then it's not about you trying to sell them more. It's about them trying to be more successful and get the greatest leverage out of your capabilities. And that changes the nature of the relationship. You're not chasing them trying to overprove all the time. They're actually leaning towards you because you're saying like, hey, this is somebody I want to bring into a meeting with my boss because they're going to help us make better decisions. And I think that's a fundamental 180-degree different relationship that you're trying to establish. And yeah, absolutely. Like if you're data driven in that approach, then you're going to help them operate, in a much more business savvy way as well.
Yeah. And so that is fantastic in theory. So to go back to something that you were saying at the very beginning of our conversation then, but it's all about the execution of it. And you kind of alluded to it where for salespeople, they love doing the handover. It's the best part of the sale, right? But and like so many things, and in your background, working with methodologies, it's the same kind of ball game where it's like, okay, we've got this fantastic methodology that in our heads is going to work amazingly, but in reality, the biggest challenge is actually getting people to follow it. And I find so often that comes from them believing in it and seeing the value from it. So looking at it from the perspective then of improving the handover. From your experience of when you're going into businesses nowadays, what's your approach to, ensuring change management goes smoothly and ensuring that there's actual execution on it?
Yeah, because it's so hard to get right. Like behavior change is really difficult. Change management as an organization. So I think the thing we find now is, especially in higher growth organizations, but pretty much everywhere, like everything is changing, right? So the pace of change is so fast. And if you think if you get down to the first line manager level or the field level, it's really overwhelming. And so how do you simplify a lot of this to make people actually better in their day job? So it's not like, again, it's not rocket science and like, how does this meet, the core things I need to do, the conversation I'm having tomorrow. I think if you're going to think about a lot of what I'm talking about is organizational support. So describing that, like to tell an account manager or a CS person to go out and do this on their own, they're going to say, wow, like I'm not a consultant. Like that's not my skill set. That's not what I was hired to do. Sounds great. I'd love to. So part of it's convincing them that this is what your customer wants. And it does go back to the really interesting study around the sales profiles and the challenger versus the relationship builder, which a lot of people have read that book or seen that. The idea that, you wouldn't be surprised to know that a lot of account managers at CS are more the relationship builder approach, right? And the relationship builder really believes like being really generous with my time is going to reward, it's great for the customer, great for me. They're going to reward me with their business. And in fact, what we now know intimately well and in painful situations is if you're friends with the customer and they're busy and they've got other stuff to do or they've got to cut budget, like you might be the last person they call because they feel bad telling you that they're moving the business to someone else or they need a downsell or, hey, they may actually bully you because it's like, okay, like you want to help me? What do I need is a discount right now. So why don't you give me like 30% discount and then you're gonna be my best friend? And so moving the conversation to business value it's a combination of organizational insight on the customer that you can package up to actually give these teams the ability to say, hey, listen, like, and sales enablement obviously works on like, how do I take those ideas and build collateral so we can steer and guide these conversations to make them much more valuable. So it's as much as like, I'm giving you some teaching advice to give to the customer from the balance of what we learned from other customers, right? Like that's the simplest, easiest thing to start giving to your teams is like, what are things I can teach to actually deliver value versus the extraction of value and things that I'm doing to help them help me sell, right? Which people can see a mile away. So that's a starting point is like, get great messaging content, get great insight that's going to be valuable to help your customer think differently about their challenges. That's generally should be an organizational capability between sales, marketing, even product marketing, and then the field teams, right? Like you create a feedback loop for that. And that's in practical terms, makes the jobs way, way easier, but you need to build a system that does that right. The thing I think is really interesting to look at right now, though, is the first line managers who manage the CS, account managers, and AEs. Like a lot of these are new managers, especially in SaaS companies these days. And they're dealing with all this change. They're communicating the stuff down to the field. They're trying to drive performance improvements. Everybody's being asked to like step up their game. And these folks, like maybe they were really good as a CS or an account manager, or maybe they were really good as a salesperson. That's not going to become a great first line sales manager. And so there's a lot of work been done and a lot of great research around this sort of idea of this double jump, right? So the jump of going from that role in the field to being a good manager of that team, but then the jump to like, oh, wait, now we actually have to do something differently than we did a few years ago when I was doing what I was doing. I'm not teaching people to do what I did. I'm teaching actually people to do things maybe I couldn't even do, which is like talk about business value and root in sort of these richer, kind of more insight-driven conversations. In order to be able to do that, they've got to be great at coaching, like behavioral science, like how do I observe objectively the behaviors that good looks like, and I reinforce those across my team. And so in practical terms, we think one of the most important things companies should focus on right now is how does a manager review the calls that their team is having with the customer through an objective lens to be able to actually pinpoint like what's the behavior change that's going to be actionable for them. And so we focused a lot on not only building sort of the skill set of what managers in any of those roles need to do now, but also giving them tools to say, okay, well, this is what a good conversation looks like. This is what good opportunity management looks like. This is how I'm going to actually observe my team and not just teach them to be like me. And so building better actionable tools there and supporting the first line sales managers or account managers, et cetera, I think is a huge weakness in organizations today and something you really need to focus on, because at the end of the day, all change is going to live and die with them, right? If they don't take it seriously or if they don't do this, people are going to struggle and they're going to go back to their old habits regardless. And then I think at the field level, as where we started, it's then being able to provide those same sort of actionable insights to the field to say, okay, how do I have a great conversation at those critical moments? What does great look like? Provide the content and provide the tools. So we're talking about opportunity management frameworks to help them kind of really install this kind of ecosystem in this operating process. And then even just guides for like, what does good look like on this? What questions do I need to ask when? What do I do with that information? And then how does that turn into the story of change that I'm going to help drive for that customer? So the connectivity between, think of it as a service roadmap for an existing account that will actually go back to the business case and what I'm helping with when it starts with the onboarding handover, it goes through the QBRs and the check-ins, it leads into the renewal and expansion conversations. It should all be rooted back to that same story. And then how am I getting great insight and information into that story to make each of those meetings valuable? So I'm being proactive, not reactive. So that's some of the main components. I will say, throwaway, I know there's a lot there, but we actually have at Insight Revenue the former head of research from CB and Gartner. And so as far as like the importance of science and data, the ability to audit what you're doing, the impact studies you're doing for your customer, the ability to do research, like this is a core capability that a lot of organizations don't have that I think, if you look CB, Gartner, some of the greatest organizations on earth on doing that. So having that capability to be able to focus for customers, they can do their own ability to audit benchmarks themselves as they go from the organization down to the individual level. Like that's a core part of what we think organizations need to stay the course and improve over time. So sorry, happy to unpack any of those, but that's kind of the four big components I would think of.
Yeah, and I think that was a perfect way of summarizing it as well. And I would second the point that you mentioned at the end, which was really the big thing that was coming up for me, which was everything that you described was really around the frameworks that you can then build to ensure the consistent adoption of it. And really what all of that stems from was, I think the bit you mentioned at the end there, which was actually what the insight is, which is we can see that by doing X is delivering result Y on the other end of it, because that's then around, because for AMs and for reps who you're implementing these changes with, is you want to be showing them this is how, what are they incentivized on? For a rep, it's around, them being able to close more deals, right? Or being able to expand. And it's taking that insight and putting it into their language, which is, regardless of all the business metrics, because, in reality, it's how will this help me to close more? How will it help me to hit my target and hit my own goals? And if you can take that insight and turn it into their language, which is how it gets them from A to B, then it's like, okay, everything else is I can buy into that. I find that often the resistance is, yeah, that all sounds great. And it can be, depending on where your business is, can be complicated, I find, sometimes to build those frameworks. And what you want really, and the most important thing, is to have everyone's belief and buy-in into, I get it. I know why we're doing this. I'm on this journey together to really see the results at the end of it.
Yeah, and what you're describing is what everyone wants to feel like everyone uses the term partnership too liberally. Like, are we a partner? Are we a vendor? Are we a supplier? Like, everyone wants to be a partner, right? Or a trusted advisor. And I think that's how you do it. Like, if you can show that I've helped many more people do exactly what you're trying to do and successfully, that's the kind of partnership I want. So guide me, be prescriptive, like steer me along the way, make sure I don't make the same mistakes others have made, versus like, oh, well, like I'm an expert on my product and I can teach you how to use it. And by the way, like I can talk to you about utilization to make sure that you spend all the credits that you're using all your licenses, right? Like we want like these kind of vanity things, like that's not really helpful. And that's why we want people to show up for the calls. We want people to pick up the phone and call you, whether you're a salesperson or someone in CS. And then you've got something valuable to share with them. And I think that's the core to it. And providing tools, training, templates, and ultimately content is how you make this really easy for folks. Versus just what you can't do is just train them and then ask them to do something aspirational and then not really show them like the steps along that yellow brick road.
You touched on what I think is a really important part there, which is it's having that data and insight to begin with to know where to then build everything else, having the tools and frameworks that come next. So you kind of mentioned the audit there, but could you elaborate a bit more on what that audit looks like and what you're looking to find and really where you're looking for the leakage in the pipeline there?
Yeah, this is great. I know you don't want me to talk about EBSTA, but this is where actually, and we're definitely excited to be, partnering with EBSTA to really look at like a combination of how you do qualitative and quantitative data analysis to really audit a go-to-market for an organization. So for us, it really starts at looking at the full life cycle of the customer and being able to understand, like what's working and not working so that you can identify best practices and scale them. And also you can identify breakdowns and blockages. And I think the data that you guys provide to your customers is fantastic. And then it's, what else would you need to be able to actually arm yourself as an organization to drive change? So, and then I think benchmarking is really important. Like how are we measuring up versus how other people are doing, just versus like we're in our own bubble. And that's where like building up a robust research capability for us and doing more and more of these studies is going to help us bring even more value as far as insight on broadly what's happening, but also organizationally, we can focus that for leadership teams. And so it starts with, I think of it as like, what's the signature for high performance? So bringing outside ideas into your organization, a lot of times leads to organ rejection. So one of the things I loved about the work of CV and Gartner, it's like really based on like, okay, a lot of things we're talking about is already happening in your organization. The signature for high performance broadly has some commonalities, but being able to tell someone individually, hey, this is what makes your top 20% better than your core in all of these different roles, like that's really important, right? So you can do it by role, but you can also do it by looking at like execution across the different stages of the customer experience. And then I think having that kind of audit, like the kind of things we do is we love to listen to people's calls and actually see what have you told them to do and what's your process and how you're on it, like what are the actual conversations you're having with your customers? That's great qualitative. Talking to people's customers. We find that most of the time you're asking self-interested questions of your customers, even what you're doing in product marketing side. So we love to do is actually ask questions of people's customers to dig into like, what are your problems? And by the way, like, I know you're buying this thing, but like, how important is that in the other areas of like what you're spending money on and what you're prioritizing as far as initiatives? Because a lot of the time, what you need to do is elevate yourself by marrying what you're doing at this level to something more strategic. But if you don't know what those other strategic things are and the relevance, like, yeah, good luck getting to the more senior stakeholders later. So what we try to do is come in and do a robust data analysis, do some robust interviews, review of what folks are actually doing today, and especially not only just interviewing folks, but listening to the conversations they're having. And then the combination of that and then doing a survey or diagnostic of our own. We can actually have assessments your teams can take to help filter back this information. For example, one of the things we love to look at to help managers out is manager time spent. First-line managers are so overwhelmed. So how are your best managers spending time and prioritizing what they do with their teams? How do their teams actually see value in the coaching they're doing and the time spent? So you can get a blueprint for like how managers can actually better prioritize and coach and things like that. So that's one specific example of something we think that's going to be super valuable as far as the audit is concerned for what our customers are going to need to be data-driven, but also like to codify an objective view of high performance that works for their organization.
I really like that way of putting it, also in the lens of looking at it as well. And it's that particular view on what, high performance looks like. And, from selfishly from what we've been looking at is, what are the common factors of high performance across sales teams, for example. And it's what are those specific things that they're doing that is helping them to, consistently hit their quota. And I think that's a really important lens to look at it through. And to the point that you made, looking at it in terms of what's the behavior, right? Even down to that individual pipeline stages is how long do you typically have deals in that stage? Because what we found through doing the analysis that we ran was you'd have some reps who would have, they'd be amazing at closing, compared to their teammates, they would perhaps close it like 50% faster. But then actually we found that they were spending loads and loads of time on discovery. And it's like, well, is it cause and effect? And it's looking for those smaller areas to drive greater efficiencies. And that's really where then to kind of answer the question that I originally asked, that's where you get to the point of, being able to see where you have the big issues in your pipeline is looking at the bigger picture to look at where are we losing out at the minute, where are we falling behind on where we need to be and where we need to get to. And often then, because from our perspective, as a tool that helps us out, the bit that's missing is actually the wider change management that goes with it, because you mentioned it earlier. There's no silver bullet for all of these things, but it's actually pulling all of these different areas together into a coherent strategy and a coherent plan as well to actually execute on it. That remains the biggest challenge.
Yeah, let me give you a perfect example. So what happens in most organizations is you'll look at your superstars, right? And you'll tell everybody like, hey, Jane over here did this, everybody do that. And it makes sense, right? Like, oh, they multi-threaded better. They got to the CEO. Let's just go do what they did. How did they do it? Well, shocking, maybe not surprising, is that the top 1-2%, most of what they're doing, you can't replicate.
Yeah.
So you're already setting it. So as far as change management is concerned, showing people an unattainable standard that's based on some of the things that are unique to that individual is a typical way of going about it. When you look at, you can identify the problem and then look at what the best people do. But actually, if you go to the full 20, if you actually go beyond the top 1-2% of those superstars and you look at the top 20% as a whole, and you use data to figure out like how are they operating differently, that's way more scalable. And so a lot of what we could, and the EBSTA data is great because it'd be like, oh yeah, you have, the best deals have this relationship score or, are multi-threaded in this way. But the question is how do you do it? And so a combination of qualitative and quantitative, you can actually look at, right, how are best people doing it? What's scalable about that? What's the process? How do we then distill that and then give it to our sales enablement team and also build the tools that are kind of tailored to our organization to allow people to do that themselves? And that people, as far as change management, you're going to believe something that's working already, on the desk next to you. But if somebody shows up with an outside idea and says, this is what's working at Google, like in most scale up, like that's not going to drive any change. So I think like what you're talking about, it's absolutely right. It's being able to use data, but then like having it resonate for individuals so it feels real and it feels practical. And getting that, it's really hard to get that right. And so I think that's a lot of companies I see, they're working on that right now. But they're going to be coming out of these like quarterly meetings and they're going to have a plan in place. But getting the connection with like actual, how do we get people to want to change and then have the capability to change is really the hard part.
Yeah, I completely agree. Zach, I want to ask you one final question before we sign off. What is one book that you would recommend to other revenue leaders?
There's been a lot of great books published by my colleagues in organizations I've worked for, and I will absolutely say go read all of those because they inform a lot of what next to be the next chapter. I think one book I always go back to that I love, and I've actually heard many people say, I'm reading it again, is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. So I think, hey, these days negotiation is important, but it's negotiation isn't about tricks. It's about a deeper understanding of the customer. And I think Chris Voss, really leans on is getting them to believe you actually care to understand what their needs are, but then actually getting them to understand your needs. And that sort of drives the conversation. And so I think it's also just really well written. So I'll go with that one. I'm sure there's a lot of others I could mention.
Yeah, I'd second that, and especially because taking what could be a fairly almost scientific type book in a way, it's as you say, extremely well written, but it tells a very good story, and that is probably a really nice place to leave it, actually, because from everything we've talked about, from understanding the customer need, it's actually being able to tell a good story throughout all of it, because it's not just my product does this. It's here's how it's going to make your day so much easier. Here's how it's going to make your quarter so much better. All right, Zach, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. For everyone that's listened, perhaps they've got some questions, perhaps they want to check you out a little bit more. Where can they find you?
Yeah, well, you can write to info@insightrevenue.com. So just reverse the revenue insight. And we're global. So we've got offices based out of Europe and the US. And so, and find me on LinkedIn. So it's Zachary Gropper. And so I look forward to, anyone who wants to reach out, have any questions, would absolutely love to continue the discussion with anyone who's listening.
We'll put links to all those down below to make it even easier to find. Brilliant. Zach, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for your time. I guess I'll go and allow you to enjoy some more of the Spanish sunshine. Yeah.
Thanks, Lee. Great to speak with you, man. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to Revenue Insights. If you want to learn more, subscribe to our newsletter and we'll deliver every episode straight to your inbox. If you have any questions, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Our links will be in the episode notes. See you next week.